Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Tom. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and I'd especially like to thank Isabelle for all her efforts in putting this presentation together. Uh, all of you, or all of our attendees today, are involved in healthcare in one aspect or another, and it's interesting that here we are in 2022 talking about the Stark Act, which was initially enacted back in 1989, believe it or not, and it was initially known as the Ethics and Patient Referrals Act. Initially, the target was, the genesis of it was dealings between physicians themselves and entities in which they had an ownership interest, oftentimes imaging centers, things of that nature. So that was what it really started out as. It's evolved over time, obviously, as the industry has changed. And There's the most recent version that we have now that came out in November of 2020, I believe it was, really started in 2018 when CMS and the OIG sent out some questions, basically, or started to take a pulse of the industry as to what they thought was happening in industry and what needed to be changed. So ultimately, the version that we've gotten in 2020, effective in 2021, is much more industry friendly than the prior version in many different aspects. And there's a synergy, if you will, between Stark and AKS. So with that, Isabelle, would you like to add anything at the outset? I'm sure I'm leaving some things out, but please feel free.
No, but thank you, Tom, for this introduction, and I'm very happy to be able to contribute on the legal sides of things here. And this is not a course on the Stark Law or the Anti-kickback statute, but just to highlight some key components of the two regulations so that we can give a heads up pretty much to our client and make sure they, as they set up new arrangements, they keep those in mind, but also think about what they already have on the books. And I think that's very important. There's no, I think, transaction today that we go through that we don't unveil something that is either not organized properly or even not signed properly, etc. And that all can trigger the Stark Law. So we have a dense slide deck, but we're not going to cover everything here. So after giving you a little bit of background on the changes, we're going to focus today on the leasing and subleasing arrangements, and then also on compensation. Physician compensation is key for all types of entities, and whether you're thinking about a transaction with private equity or whether you're a hospital and have to keep up with retention trends and what your recruiters are telling you and what you can do from a legal standpoint. The appendix sections features a number of documents that you'll be able to peruse at your convenience, but otherwise, let's just get started. Tom, so thank you for talking a little bit, if you will go to the next slide, about the general themes, and definitely more leeway to incentivize patients to obtain care from providers here. But as you will see on the next slide, the Stark Law and the Anti-kickback statute really function totally differently. Why we focus so much on the Stark Law is that it's what we call a strict liability statute. It means that you don't have to have the intent to do what the government is saying you're going to be doing, which is committing fraud pretty much. But because you do not fit squarely in the law or one of the exceptions of the law, you're going to be deemed liable and in breach of that statute. The second difference is that it only applies to physicians, and that's defined broadly by it's an MD deal, dentist, podiatrist, and then you also have chiropractors and ODs. So whereas the anti-kickback statute applies to everybody, and by everybody I mean not just healthcare providers. So if a sales rep from a medical device company or a pharmaceutical company is trying to entice a provider to increase referrals to a lab, for example, that would fall under the anti-kickback statute. So both focus on remuneration, which they view as kickbacks or bribes or rebates or anything that's cash or in kind, but that is intended to basically generate revenues and referrals for something. Under the Stark Law, we're talking about designated health services, and that's a very, very narrow section of services in healthcare, but still it's pretty large because it includes all your clinical laboratory services, PT, radiology, everything, imaging, etc. And but we'll show you that we have some changes there. And then on terms of the anti-kickback statute, everything's covered pretty much. So everything that is reimbursable by the federal healthcare program will be covered. And we've seen even trends where it goes broader. So in the next slide, you have a summary about all this just for reference back. But let's go straight to the changes of the Stark Law from 2020. So the changes enacted in 2020 come into effect at different stages depending on which one we're talking about. But broadly, we had on the Stark side, we had 5 new definitions, and they pretty much focus on what we called value-based care delivery in the payment system. So under the value-based healthcare delivery systems, we're basically talking about an area where the providers are taking on full financial risk. Some of them, some of you might refer, that are old enough, might refer to this as capitation, and there's some flavor of this in there, but it's not exactly like this. We also have 3 new Stark Law exceptions. So one of them is definitely for value-based compensation, but we also have a limited remuneration arrangement and also donation of cybersecurity technology. On the anti-kickback statute, the laws also, the new statute is following definitely the trend about cybersecurity. And then moving on to the next slide, we can see that we have also 5 new anti-kickback statute safe harbors, and then 4 that have been amended to keep up with technology. All these, nobody is able to know these by heart. The next slide provides direct links to all the statutes where you can find them. These are the original ones where you should refer to if you have any doubt. They're searchable, and you can fairly easily find what you're looking for, especially since we've provided in this slide deck references to each of the exceptions we'll be covering. We're not going to be able to cover everything, but we'll cover as much as possible, of course. So I think that takes us, Bo, to our first polling section.
Yep. Oh. First polling question. The liability for anti-kickback statute violation is?
All right, that should be pretty easy.
All right, leave it open for about 20 more seconds. Reminder to vote in order to get CPE and CLE credit. All right, 10 seconds and I'll close it out. All right, and here are the results.
Yeah, the majority got it, both civil and criminal. Very good. That was an easy one.
All right. Tom, so
Okay.
how about the fair market value? That's your favorite.
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide if we could, Rachel. So it's interesting to me because fair market value, as I originally knew it, was a result of Revenue Ruling 5960, which was an IRS device that was used for the valuation of estates and trust, things of that nature, state purposes. And that defines fair market value as the amount of at which property would exchange hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller when neither is under the when one is not under the compulsion to buy and the latter is not under the compulsion to sell, both having knowledge of reasonable and of relevant facts. That has changed over time because not that that has changed over time, but what you see here in the healthcare arena is there's still talk of a hypothetical buyer and a hypothetical seller, but when you look at the transactions that are being discussed, they're actual transactions. So it's always something that you have to keep in mind, that whenever you're applying something that deals with fair market value, even though it's intended to be a hypothetical, you do have to give credence to the fact, or lend credence to the fact, that there are circumstances specific to whatever it is you're doing that will cause your conclusion to be nuanced in some way. And it's interesting to note that even CMS, they talk about extenuating circumstances when it comes to the payment of payments to physicians. If we go to the next slide. So there's three definitions here. So general market value has actually been broken out for three different tranches. So you have for assets. So when you're talking about the purchase of an asset, it's the price at which the asset would bring at the date of the acquisition. And you'll notice that the last sentence says not otherwise in a position to generate business for each other. So neither the buyer nor the seller should be taking into consideration their ability to generate business for the other. The next deals with compensation. So again, we've got this concept of general market value, and you're talking about what the compensation is that would be paid to the parties entering into that arrangement based on bona fide bargaining. And again, you will see that language, not in a position to otherwise generate business for each other. And then lastly, you see it in terms of the rental of equipment or office space, talking about what the actual bona fide bargaining would bring, again, not being able to generate business for the other. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's this concept of commercially reasonable. And not to read the slide, but essentially what they're saying is that it needs to make sense. And when we say that it needs to make sense, there's an admission by CMS essentially that they understand that not all arrangements are going to be profitable. And I think this was geared towards there being community need that needed to be addressed, where there might not be a profit as a result of someone providing services. So they put that language in there specifically to give credence to the fact that an arrangement may be sensible, but it may not be profitable. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of being commercially reasonable.
Tom,
yes.
We had a perfect example of that where I was in some of the fraud and abuse cases. They were describing the compensation of a neurosurgeon that was attracted to a new rural hospital. And that surgeon didn't pay for itself, but the community was so much better off by having that surgeon there, and then being able to attract others that would gravitate around the hospital, that the government said actually that was okay.
And we've seen that as well. I mean, look, you always want to make money. Obviously, you don't want to get into a venture with the intent of losing money, obviously, but there are circumstances where, again, profitability is not going to be a primary motivating factor for doing something. And to a certain extent, I think that's a good thing. Next slide. Actually, might be a polling question. Am I right?
Yep. We are on to our second polling question. General market value precludes the ability to generate business for each other in relation to. All right, about 20 more seconds. Like 10 seconds and I will close it out. Okay, and here are the results.
Right. Yep, everyone got that. Okay, next slide. So then we're getting into the leasing and subleasing agreements. So with all of the, I'll go to the next slide, I'm sorry. With all of these arrangements where there's going to be any sort of leasing, anything along those lines, you get into this idea of fair market value being at arm's length. And that's an important concept here because you want to make sure that whatever is being paid is consistent with the marketplace. When you're talking about the rental of office space, again, what you would want it to be at arm's length. You don't want to give consideration to whether there would be any potential referrals between the two. So you're not giving any sort of credence or putting any additional value to the relationship that may exist. But you're looking to be at a fair market value, arm's length, deal, for lack of a better way of putting it. And it's important that anything that needs to be looked at, meaning the property itself, is looked at. So you're going to want to look at the square footage, for example. You're going to want to look at whether there's any equipment that's being leased as part of it or any subleases, whether there's anything that needs to be given consideration there. And the consideration has to be carefully looked at in terms of, again, getting back to that whole idea of what is fair market value, what would be at arm's length, and again, not in consideration of any potential way of referring any business back and forth between each other. So that's the main concept there. If we go to the next slide, when we're talking about real estate leasing agreements, again, we're talking about what's the supply and demand. What is the square footage that's being potentially going to be rented? Where is the geographic location? What is the rent that's being paid in that particular locale? Are there any physical limitations on the property? So in other words, if you're going to be renting X number of square feet, are there certain things about that particular layout that are going to allow you to have usable square footage that's less than the total amount that's going to be leased? That needs to be given consideration. And then, switching hats for a moment, the lessor is going to want to take a look at what is the return on that investment as part of their due diligence. They're going to need to see that they're making some money on it without getting into a situation where it looks like they're being unduly enriched for entering into the relationship. And then lastly, there's that idea of, does it make sense to enter into this lease agreement, or would it be easier potentially to build something out? And that's just that's just a practical point of view in terms of that. And it's similar with the leasing of equipment. Is it beneficial to lease an older piece of equipment and then maybe have to make some renovations to it, make some changes to it? Is it obsolete in any way? So there's certain things that need to be considered in terms of the leasing of equipment. One thing that I thought I would point out is the use of an outside appraiser is not required, but because of the things that come into play here, it often makes sense to have an outsider brought in, especially when it comes to something like real estate, where there are a lot of moving parts, for lack of a better way of putting it, or in terms of just about anything else in terms of compensation, etc. You know, the feeling is amongst many healthcare companies is, you know, they may not consider themselves to be expert in performing certain tasks, whether it's performing the valuation of a particular piece of real estate, whether it's valuing equipment, or whether it's determining compensation. So they will rely on outside folks to do that. But I did want to point out it's not necessarily required, in case anyone has been wondering that.
Tom, that's a good point, but it also helps in terms of proving that this was an arm's length negotiation to have third parties there. So there are definitely multi-purposes there for the outside appraisers.
Absolutely, and again, I'm not trying to, you know, generate work for myself, so to speak, but I know that has been an issue. I think some people are under the false impression that they have to have an outside person. They don't. The question becomes, do you really want to be the one that, if you are questioned on something, that has to be answering questions as to why it was X dollars per square feet, or why, you know, why Dr. Jones was getting paid a certain dollar amount, things of that nature. So to your point, yes, it's nice to have something upon which to fall back that correlates. The other thing is too, when the valuation piece is done, oftentimes what will happen is the ultimate conclusion will be looked at from different methodologies. So you'd be looking at it from an income approach, you would be looking at it from a market approach. So not only if I'm paying X dollars per square foot, let's say in a lease arrangement, what does that equate to in terms of the profitability to the lessor? You know, what is the lessee paying, and how does that correlate? So there's a number of different considerations, but I agree with you. I think it's nice having someone else, so to speak, to be the person carrying that pail of water for you. Next slide.
So the Stark Law definitely comes into play with all these types of leasing arrangements. And so again, if we are discussing a physician and who is leasing or providing the space from an entity that either he provides services to, or there's some form of remuneration going on between the other parties, whether it's as an employment agreement, a contract, or any type of services involving designated health services, then we trigger the Stark Law exception. Generally, what we look at is, are we dealing with two healthcare providers, and is one of them a physician? If yet, then we try to structure these agreements based on the Stark Law exceptions so that we stay squarely within the exception, no matter if the facts and circumstances slightly change in the future. And we have several of them, and we see a lot of confusion in terms of which one to use. So whether we're talking about equipment leasing or office space leasing, here are your options, and here is where we see the conclusion. So we have an exception for the rental of office space. So that works for leases and subleases. We also have a rental of equipment exception, and that only works for equipment, cannot be stretched to anything further. But we also have the fair market value compensation exception that now can be applied to both the office space and the equipment leases, and that can be helpful. But where we see a lot of issues is when we have subleases. Are they really subleases, or are they what the Stark Law calls timeshare arrangements? So I've provided the definitions, and I want to, going to the next slide, I'll point out some of the key terms. So if you are putting together an office lease, okay, or sublease actually, here is how they need to be structured. And the big change in the 2020 version of the Stark Law that came into effect in 2021 is that exclusive use means that the lessee or any other lessees of the same office space use the office space to the exclusion of the lessor or any person or entity related to the lessor. So, and the lessor cannot be an invitee of the lessee to use the office space. So this basically means that this type of exception doesn't apply if you are sharing the office space with different people at the same time. And that was always the intent, but now we have it in writing. So this is why also I mentioned timeshare lease agreements, and that's where when different practices are sharing the same space and they don't have exclusive use of a space or a suite, then we have to structure this differently. I think the key component that everybody knows now is that it has to be at least 1 year and it has to be in writing, although that can mean different things if we fail to do that. Going on to the next slide, again, we know that on the next slide, you'll see that the rental charges over the term of the lease cannot be determined in any manner, and that's emphasized here, that take into account the volume or the value of any referrals. So this means that you can't use a percentage of the revenue raised or attributable to the services performed or business generated in the office space. So for example, think about a dentist who has a separate suite or that leases to another dentist or another subspecialty in the dental arena. He cannot base the rent space on how many patients are seen by that new dentist next door. That is not permissible. So that's really the key one we see out there all the time. And I think a lot of accountants sometimes forget that physician includes dentists and chiropractors, and it's a little broader than MDs and DOs. So that's one we encounter. In terms of the office equipment, next slide, that is actually, we again have the idea that the equipment, there is exclusive use again. So if you are renting equipment, and it can be full-time, part-time, perhaps, if that's structured properly. However, during that time period, you have exclusive use, and if not, it is stored in a closet and nobody else can use it during the time that you're leasing it. If you're on the next slide, you will see.
Isabelle, could I ask a question before we go on to the next slide? I'm just curious of something. So if you're representing the lessor, and the lessor is going to be leasing out, let's say it's office space, maybe they're even subletting some of their employees, for lack of a better way of putting it, some equipment, things of that nature. Are there any other special considerations that you think need to be discussed with the potential lessor? Are there certain, I mean, I'm just thinking in my mind, what happens if someone enters the building and then slips and falls, what's the additional liability? Are there other things that you have to give consideration to?
Oh, totally. So first, some people like to lump everything together. It's possible to draft a lease of rental space with office equipment in the same lease, because there's some overlap, as you can see. It has to be commercially reasonable, etc. So some of the same language is going to apply, but there's nothing wrong in also discussing the liability. I think in terms of a space lease, everything regarding OSHA, and in the medical field, we have medical waste also. Now we have COVID, we have, all that other extra layer of liability. The landlords, in the case of a space, is going to really want to push all that down onto the person or the entity leasing the building. But in terms of the equipment also, it becomes tricky and in terms of who's responsible for what. So some of the key terms we see in there is as is. With some of the equipment, you have to be careful to take also into consideration the intellectual property of the equipment. So certain, for example, software will have licenses attached to them, and they are usually specific to the person who signed the contract with the provider of that license, or who signed the sub-license. So these cannot be easily rented out to somebody else without incurring some liability there. And even though the lessor may try on paper to push down the liability on the lessee, that the lessee will indemnify them for anything that happens, if they happen to have basically assigned a license or sub-license to some intellectual property, then they may be triggering some legal issues for themselves that will also sometimes render their insurance coverage ineffective. So all the problems get compounded in terms of liability, and indemnification provisions are not the panacea that everybody thinks they are. Everybody's putting them everywhere. But I want to point out something to everybody. If you look at your insurance policy, and I know that's not a fun read for a sunny weekend for sure, there is usually right in the beginning there some language that states that if you agree contractually to accept liability for various things, it's usually described, then it may render either some sections of your policy null and void or the entire coverage. So you have to be very, very careful then with that language. There are very few courts that have actually enforced these policies, because of course the insurance companies are very, very powerful, and it's very easy for them to kind of disclaim their own liability under their contract like that. But basically what they don't want you to do, they don't want you to sign blank indemnification provisions and without negotiating. So indemnification doesn't have to be contractual. It can be just fought out in court. At common law, we have all sort of recourses for that. So again, indemnification provisions, don't sign a blank check there, and don't think it solves every one of your problems because you're the one imposing it on the other parties. The courts don't tend to disfavor them no matter what. But so again, tons of little details to think about. If it's if you're leasing personnel, as the employer, you're still going to retain, for example, the workers' comp liability if they get injured on the job. And actually, as the lessee of the employees, you may, although you think, because this is all going to happen under a professional services agreement, you may think that you're not liable for any of the workers' compensation or any of the taxes because they're not W-2. If the IRS comes and audits the agreement and finds it's actually they should be employees, then that's not going to work. So also the layers of liability there, but these are very we enter into these all the time, and maybe a little bit too casually, as your questions, I think, points out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen it, and that's part of the reason for the question. As I said, I've seen it, and I know that there are things that go along with it beyond just determining what the fair market value of the lease is. So that was really the reason for the question, and your answer really shed light on some very key things that need to be given consideration. Absolutely, thank you.
So Rachel, if you want to go to the next slide, but we'll keep going to try to cover as much of a material we have in there. But we have a new, it's not a new exception, but it's actually updated. And basically under a fair market value compensation exception, that fits for both office space and equipment space, we can be covered under Stark Law if we structure this properly. The nice thing here is that this does not have to be for at least 1 year. But there are many, many requirements. Actually, this slide only provides a summary of requirements, and you have to be careful. I think this one should only be, it shouldn't be your default exception to reach for, but if you're trying to fit into one exception, it might be very, very useful. So again, nothing can be based, it has to be commercially reasonable. You can't be basing it on the volume or value of the referrals, etc. And on the last couple of slides in this section, we have described the timeshare arrangement. And that's when the exception you're going to be able to use if you don't have exclusive use of that space. And again, it's not a lease, it's a timeshare arrangement, and that is a brand new exception for you because CMS realized that there was the need for it to separate it and give people all the information they needed. So some people were already, the name actually doesn't mean, if you call this arrangement a lease or a sublease arrangement, but you meet all the components of in the requirements, you're perfectly fine. So that's what a lot of people were doing it. But in terms of the equipment, just a reminder that this does not apply to advanced imaging equipment and clinical or pathology laboratory equipment. So I'll let you review these details. And of course, we can be available offline if you have any further questions about these arrangements. But I think then that takes us to our next polling question.
Isabelle, just real quick, if I may, do you see a lot of time sharing arrangements taking place?
We don't see as many as we should, I will say.
Okay, fair enough.
Because I think a lot of arrangements structured as subleases should be actually timeshare arrangements, but we're discovering them through transactions oftentimes, and we just correct them.
Got it. Okay.
On to our third polling question. The Stark Law first became law in
I think, Tom, you gave that answer.
I did, and George H.W. Bush was president, if that helps anybody.
right, about 20 more seconds. All right, 10 seconds and I'll close it out. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. And here are the results.
Very good. 1989 was the correct answer.
All right.
Very good. All right. Could we go to the next slide, Rachel, please? Okay, is this you or is this me, Isabelle? This is you, right?
But not a lot of people want to take the DHS definition. I can jump. So basically, the DHS definition was revised, and it was also to clarify some things. Services paid by Medicare as part of a composite rate, think ASC services or SNFs Part A payments, are now excluded explicitly from the definition of a DHS. And of course, in a typical healthcare law type of statute, except if those services are included in the definition. So home health services, for example, are specifically listed on the left column. So that's it. But in terms of definition, just know that they clarified things that They just don't want you to think wrongly that inpatient hospital services is everything inpatient, including SNFs. So, but CMS actually interestingly declined to clarify what is outpatient hospital service. So of course we fix it one element at a time, and I'm sure there'll be more questions, and the next round we'll be updating that part of the definition. But Tom, you are deeply involved with crafting physician compensation.
Yep, so let's go to the next slide.
What are the key issues?
Perfect, yep. So when we get into physician compensation, we're back to that fair market value. And you talk about, again, the last couple of words in this definition, the value in an arm's length transaction consistent with the general market value of the subject transaction. So it's specific to, remember early on I was saying, when you looked at fair market value under Revenue Ruling 5960, it was strictly hypothetical. This is asking you to give consideration to things specific to the transaction and the general market value, what's happening in the marketplace. One thing that we need to be cognizant of is when compensation is being determined, that not only are the basics understood, right? So what exactly is this physician providing? What services? What type of physician are they? How many patients are they seeing on a day? All these different questions. You're also looking to make sure that you know where it is they are providing their services, because a physician working in New York is going to be compensated at a rate potentially much different from someone working, or a physician working in Des Moines, Iowa, for example. And nothing against Des Moines, Iowa, it's just factually that's the way it is. So consideration needs to be given to what's transpiring with the actual transaction. And we're getting into this idea of not only is it fair market value when you're looking at it in terms of what someone else might be paid, but when you're looking at it in terms of the general market value to the compensation of the services that are being provided, what would that individual, that physician, look to be getting paid based on what he or she knows about what they're able to bring to the table? So that's something that needs to be given consideration as well. We could go to the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about, and by the way, old rules is just, that's me saying old rules, it's nothing formal. So the old rule said that the compensation had to be set in advance, it had to be consistent with fair market value, not determined in a manner to take into account the volume or value of referrals or other business generated by the referring physician. The new rules discuss volume and value separately. So there's been this idea, this change, if you will, and I would call it a more friendly approach to CMS basically recognizing that practices have changed, the way that people are looking to grade physicians, and when I say people, I should say institutions are looking to grade physicians, is not necessarily just on the number of patients they see or what have you. It's the quality of the service. It's knowing that once someone leaves your hospital after having a procedure done or whatever the service was that was provided, that they're not coming back with infections and things of that nature. So there's a quality aspect to it. And I think there's this consideration now that's being given to good practice, for lack of a better way of putting it. If we go to the next slide, when we being Withum and other companies take a look at how physicians are going to be compensated, there's a number of things that we look at. And we look at different surveys, for example. Those surveys, again, we generally look at those specific to the geographic location in which we're operating. But we're also looking at it in terms of, the background of that particular physician, their education, how many years they've been in practice, the number of patients they're seeing on a daily basis, assuming patients is the metric that you'd be working off of, their gross billings, their collections, things of that nature. And basically the reason I'm pointing this out is because CMS basically reaffirmed its position that the compensation models that many of us work off of that are based on the WRVUs or collections, the productivity-based compensation, those are safe for us to use, and they don't take into account the volume or the value of physician referrals. So that's a good thing from our perspective. If we go to the next slide, I would point out that, and again, some of this is my wording, my terminology. There was a specific example that was given, and I believe it was in response to a question that someone posed to CMS. And there was an example given, and it was basically that of an orthopedic surgeon, who I'm referring to as a rock star. And that particular orthopedic surgeon in the example was someone who was very well known for performing knee surgeries. And not only was that individual known for performing knee surgeries, but they were known in the sports industry. And the doctor themselves, had a bit of what I would call a celebrity status, for lack of a better way of putting it. So reading into it, that is in essence what they were saying. So there's a recognition here by CMS that any organization looking to bring on that particular orthopedic surgeon would have to pay more than, or might have to pay more than what a typical orthopedic surgeon would make. So the example that was given was an orthopedic surgeon would typically make $450,000 a year. There needs to be a recognition, or there is a recognition, that to employ that particular individual might require more than $450,000 a year. The next example that was given was the opposite end of the spectrum. And it was a family doctor who, according to the survey, should have been making about $250,000 a year. The entity that was looking to pay that individual they had some issues economically, and there was a question as to reimbursement rates, things of that nature. So there's a recognition by CMS that that particular physician may not make the $250,000 a year that one might normally expect to make. So there's a recognition, if you will, that the surveys, although they are beneficial, are not meant to be the be all and end all. So I think that's important. And sticking with that last point there, referring to the physician making the 250, there's also the CMS also recognized that there may be situations where the compensation paid to a physician may result in an ongoing loss. And they mentioned that there could be reasons for that. So although it might cause concern to them being CMS, they also recognize that there could be valid reasons why that particular arrangement made sense. So all of that is, I think, good in the recognition that things are not necessarily cookie cutter, and they're trying to give greater flexibility to folks in the way that they structure compensation and still be in compliance with Stark. So that's something for consideration. We go to the next slide. So item number one here, CMS specifically, we continue to believe that fair market value of a transaction, particularly compensation for physician services, may not always align with published valuation data compilations such as salary surveys. There's a certain train of thought, and I've seen it, where there's this idea that if you are paying physicians in the 75th percentile or less, that equates to fair market value. And that's not necessarily the case. There are considerations that could cause one to be paid above the 75th percentile, and there are certain circumstances that might exist that would cause one to be paid less than what the industry averages might dictate. So again, those are important things to consider. What's also interesting is if the compensation agreement is going to have any value-based arrangements in it, those need to be established up front. So whatever the metrics are that are being measured, those need to be given consideration to. And with that, I will go over to, if we go to the next slide, I think we go back over to you, Isabelle.
Yeah, so thank you, Tom. Excellent points. And now we have more definitions to clarify all this. So they revised the definition of remuneration. Everything that's been crossed out or added is in bold here. And I'll let you review that on your own. But going to the next slide, we also have a new definition about what is set in advance. So set in advance appears in many of the Stark Law exceptions. We always say compensation has to be set in advance. Well, what does that mean? So it doesn't mean that the amount is actually set in advance, so that, for example, your base compensation is always going to be $400,000. It actually means that it's the methodology for coming up with the compensation that needs to be set in advance. And that was a welcome clarification for everybody, but I think we all healthcare providers that have experience in that domain were already interpreting it that way for the most part. And one nice thing also is that we can now modify compensation during the term of the arrangements under certain requirements, so we're no longer prohibited to do so. Jumping on to some new special rules on compensation also is on the next slide, you'll see that we have the basic formula for using a unit-based compensation and how to structure this so that the volume or value standard or the other business generated standard doesn't trip us up. So basically, CMS finalized an objective test that defines exactly when a lease will be considered to take into account the volume or the value of their referral. And under that test, the lease will only be considered to take into account the volume or value of the referrals if the mathematical formula used to calculate the amount of a rent includes referrals or other business generated as a variable, and if the amount of a rent correlates with the number or value of a physician's referrals or the physician's generation of the other business. So I have an example for that actually, and because it's sometimes hard to grasp what we mean, and CMS picked up on that and provided several. So figure, for example, a lease, space lease arrangement where a physician leases the space for $5,000 a month. And the following would be considered to be taking into account the volume or value of other business generated or the referrals if the rent would go down $5 each time, for example, that same physician who's leasing the space would send his or her patients to get a diagnosis test downstairs to the landlord's business. So that would be obviously not complying with the Stark Law, and that wouldn't work. So the next slide will show you how the new rule also basically clarified that it is actually possible to have specific language and require that a physician refers an established percentage or ratio of his referrals to a particular provider. We already had seen this in, but not in so specific form, in many physician employment agreements with hospitals, where it stated that they had to refer to the network of a health system. But now they can be required in terms of a specific percentage. Of course, CMS didn't specify which percentage is okay and which not, and you still have to meet a lot of the other requirements, but it is now possible to set a percentage. So that was new. The jumping on, I know we're running tight on time, so I'll jump on the next slide and talk about some of the compensation to or from a physician. So when we think about unit-based arrangements, they provided the formula that will make it or not related to the volume or value of referrals. And basically, either if you have a negative correlation between the number or volume of a physician's referrals to the entity leasing, when we're talking about compensation from a physician, and the reverse is true when it's compensation to a physician. So again, it's nice to have clarification when we're analyzing these types of arrangements. A nice and new also Stark exception on the next slide describes the limited remuneration arrangement. So for anything under $5,000 in the aggregate per calendar year, and that number is going to be adjusted for inflation, by the way, so don't remember just 5,000, it's going to go up in time. We don't need to have a signed agreement now. But again, it cannot be based on the volume and value of referral, et cetera, et cetera. But they realize that so many smaller arrangements fall through the cracks because of their de minimis, so that we now have a nice exception. So next, on the next slide, we will address some changes to the group practice exception. So in order to avail yourself of many of the profit sharing or bonus compensation arrangements under a Stark law, it's a reminder for everybody that these are only applicable if the entity or the physicians in that entity actually fall under the group practice definition. And I have included several slides in the appendix that actually gives you that definition. And critical in there is what we call the 75% requirement. So in order for the referrals of a specific physician to be protected by, for example, the in-office ancillary exception, we need to fit squarely into the definition of the group practice. It's not an exception, it's a definition. So if you have the case scenario where you have a lot of physicians employed by your group that also do a lot of outside activities, and even sometimes we've seen in transactions that even have their own company and provide services under a different company and PI, etc. That's where we get into trouble, because there's no way that a physician can provide 75% of his array of services to more than one entity, basically. So, and that's when we run into trouble. So, but there are many other requirements. In terms of the changes that we are seeing now, overall profits really means that it's the profits derived from all DHS of any component of a group that consists of at least 5 physicians. And this also, you don't have to use 5, but or you could be also all the physicians of a group. If we have less than 5 physicians in the group, then it's whatever that number is. But this is basically the end of the split pooling, service by service, where you kind of pick and choose what you include in the overall profits and how you share it based on who refers to who for certain ancillary services. So this was clearly defined, and I think this is going to be a very, very, very important clarification, and nobody will have the excuse anymore to say we didn't understand, because it was actually not very clear in the past. So, but again, there are ways to structure this so that the overall profits are not directly related to the volume or value and referrals. And simply, you can divide it by per capita. So, you know, 5 members in your group, you divide by 5 the profits, but that's not often how the practices view it. You can also just distribute it based on the group's revenues attributed to services that are not DHS. And then, or you can, if you have less than 5% of total revenues that are DHS, and we see specialties sometimes like ophthalmology where that happens, then you can also divide up the profits like that. Otherwise, you have to stick to the the equity of each of the owners in the group practice. Same thing on the next slide, is same clarification actually for the productivity bonus. So again, the productivity bonuses and the profit sharing, these niches, these exceptions only work if you meet the definition of a group practice. I think we can skip over some of the other definitions that we've inserted, but basically we now know what's a writing requirement, and there were also changes to the personal services and management contracts, safe harbor under the anti-kickback statute. So I know we've shared a lot, but before we can conclude and give you those precious credits, I think we have one more polling question, don't we, Rachel?
We do. So this is our fourth and final polling question. About compensation arrangements. And we did get a couple of audience questions, but we want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I will forward them over to Isabelle and Tom, and they will be able to connect with you offline to answer your questions.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And folks, thank you for staying on. We realize it's after 1 o'clock, but thank you. We still have 82 attendees, which is great. Thank you.
Thank you. And as a reminder, you have a lot of materials in the appendix, and feel free to save those, and you'll have those definitions right at your fingertips. Some of them are not 100% there in terms of all the details, so, but you know where to find it, and just click on those links.
All right, I'll leave the polling question up for 10 more seconds. All right, and here are the results real quick.
There it is. Very good.
All right.
Very good. Excellent.
So,
All right. Well, I guess that concludes our webinar today. Again, thank you all for participating. We appreciate it. Isabelle, thank you so much. You're wonderful. Anything you'd like to add before we conclude?
no, I'm really glad we get to speak about this topic, because everybody thinks it's an old law, but we still find plenty of non-compliance in that arena, and it's too bad to find it at the time of a transaction.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Thank you so much. And Rachel, you'll send over the questions, correct?
Yep. And thank you everyone for participating. And as a reminder, the slide deck and recording will be sent to everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Au revoir.